Well, the Rockwood School Board is set to meet today. This as the district deals with curriculum controversy threats, among other issues.
Tonight, a curriculum controversy. Some are accusing the new California Ethnic Studies program of promoting a political agenda.
A heated debate inside the boardroom tonight as parents, locals, and students gave public comment. One group says that teachers shouldn't be teaching outside of the curriculum without parent or board approval.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of Courageous Conversations about our schools. This is your host, Ken Futernick, and the questions I will be discussing with my guests are these. How should students learn about current events and controversial topics? And who should determine the curriculum in public schools? In particular, what role should parents have? These questions are stirring up some pretty intense debates among policymakers, educators, students, and parents in many states across the country. There are some who want schools to stay away from current events and controversies altogether, while others believe these things are and have long been a staple of quality education in a democratic society.
First off, what's a controversial topic? Controversial topic is pretty much any topic about which people disagree with enough passion in order to continue the disagreement to try to pursue their end. And, as a government teacher, that sounds pretty much like what Madison was trying to protect in Fed 10.
It's ironic, so to speak, that we're talking about controversies in terms of current events when it's probably one of the most essential things that you can do in the classroom is teach current events.
Topics that I've taught in U.S. history and world history for over a decade were never controversial. But all of a sudden, me teaching factually about something that happened in the past has taken on a political tone that it never had before.
I think it was COVID and remote learning that really opened up parents' eyes to what was going on in the schools, and they saw it firsthand.
If you're familiar with this podcast, you know that what we do here is to turn down the volume with guests who have very different and diverse perspectives on educational controversies like the ones we are considering today. I ask my guests to share their views, but also to listen carefully to ensure they really understand what others are thinking. I'm not interested in avoiding conflict, quite the contrary. I'm hoping we have healthy conflict, just not toxic conflict, the kind that causes us to close our minds or to stay in our bubbles or worse, to demonize one another. So with that, I'm going to introduce my guests. And first we have Monty F. Borgelli IV. Welcome to the podcast, Monty. Please tell our listeners what and where you teach and how you got into the teaching profession.
Sure, Ken. Thank you for inviting me. I just want to preface by saying that I am speaking in my own capacity. I teach at Thomas Jefferson High School for Science and Technology in Fairfax County. I've been teaching for 16 years, and prior to that, I practiced law for 12 years. So I kind of came to teaching as a result of the influences of teachers I've had throughout my life, from grade school to law school. And I've been teaching, as I say, for 16 years. I teach American history, I teach government, and I teach a law course.
Thanks, Monty. And I was going to say what you asked me to say, which is that you're participating in this podcast in your personal capacity, and that your statements and opinions are your personal views and don't necessarily reflect the views of your employer. Next, we have State Senator John Schickel from Kentucky. Senator Schickel, a Republican, was the primary sponsor of Kentucky law, SB 1, that includes some sections called the Teaching American Principles Act, which is relevant in today's conversation. The governor vetoed SB 1, and the General Assembly, as I understand it, overrode the veto. Isn't that correct, John?
That's correct.
Welcome, Senator. You heard Monty's disclaimer. Can we assume that everything you say represents the entire General Assembly in Kentucky?
Probably not, but hopefully it represents some of my constituents anyway. That's my job, to represent my constituents. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, sure. And just say a bit about how you got into politics, just for a minute, and how about your interest in education?
Well, first of all, everyone always asks me that. How did I get into politics? I get that question a lot, and I always come back with, my job is not politics. My job is public service. I enjoy politics. It's a hobby of mine, but my job is public service. And I think there's a distinction there because too many people think they're in politics, and we're not. We're in public service. We're there to serve the people. But my interest in public service really has been my whole life. It started with my mom and dad growing up, one of 11 children. And my parents were very much encouraged us to, in dialogue, talking about current events. And my dad was big into discussions and listening and all the things that you just talked about, Ken. And I got really, at a young age, I was very blessed to be exposed to a lot of that. I was kind of different because my dad was an artist, my mother was a musician, and since I was a little boy, I always wanted to be a policeman. And so I'm a retired policeman, but later in my career, I did mostly prison and jail administration. And then the job right before I retired, I headed up the U.S. Marshal Service in Kentucky under President Bush. But I've served in the Senate for 14 years, and I really enjoy it. It's just a great privilege to represent my constituents. And my interest in education, it's interesting because I really think it comes from, and this is something I've only been able to appreciate probably in the last 10 or 15 years of my life, is my interest in the liberal arts. And that I can remember my parents were so interested in the liberal arts, and I thought they were full of baloney. But they planted a seed apparently because I've gotten older, and after I retired and started reading and doing things on my own, I've really gotten interested in that, and that really has kind of been my interest in education is an advocacy for the liberal arts in education, because we don't hear that much at the state capitol.
Well, thank you for that, and I think it helps us all understand how you got interested in public service and in the field of education. Our next guest is Robert Pondicio. Robert is currently a senior fellow at the American Enterprise Institute in Washington, D.C., where he focuses on K-12 education, curriculum, teaching, school choice, and charter schooling. And before that, he was a policy analyst and education reform expert at the Thomas B. Fordham Institute, a conservative-leaning education policy think tank. Welcome, Robert.
Thank you, Ken.
In a blog post from 2020, you wrote that the study of current events is not the K-8 staple it once was, but it's a missing piece of the curriculum, particularly well-suited to at-home learning in the time of the coronavirus. And it's a habit once formed that can continue as a significant value add once life and school resume their normal shape, contributing to literacy and language proficiency, as well as cultivating a disposition for civic mindedness. So I gather you still think current events is an important thing to happen. We're going to, of course, get into more depth on that, but I just comment on that comment you made.
I'm humbled you found that blog post, because as soon as the senator started talking about current events, then the liberal arts, by the way, my radar went full on, because that's kind of my work. Interestingly enough, I mean, I know we're going to talk about current events from the standpoint of controversies in terms of teaching. Look, you describe me as a policy guy. I always say, look, I pretend to be an education policy person. What I really am is a practice person. I'm a former school teacher. I taught fifth grade in the South Bronx for many years. More recently, I taught civics and history at Democracy Prep, a charter school in Harlem, New York. But my guiding light in this work is a fellow by the name of E.D. Hirsch Jr., who some folks will remember from that kind of, out of left field bestseller from 40 years ago called Cultural Literacy. And I've said this so many times, I can't begin to count, that Hirsch was the one theorist who described what I saw in my South Bronx classroom every day: kids who could decode, read, print, but struggled to understand. And the reason they struggled to understand had nothing to do had nothing to do other than lack of background knowledge. So I've been an unrepentant disciple of Hirsch and current events. In other words, at the risk of oversimplifying, too much of American education encourages kids to kind of look in the mirror, so to speak, like, plumb the depths of their 8-year-old souls, as opposed to looking out the window. And for reasons we don't have time to go into, the amount of background knowledge that you bring to reading is the thing that makes you a knowledgeable reader. So it's ironic, so to speak, that we're talking about controversies in terms of current events, when it's probably one of the most essential things that you can do in the classroom is teach current events. There are other reasons, and now I'll put on my civic educator hat and say, we want kids to grapple earnestly with current events, because that's part of what we do in school is preparation for citizenship. But all of this is very, very complicated, and there's lots of ways to come at this. So I look forward to the discussion.
Thank you, Robert. And finally, we have Emily Glanker. She's a social studies teacher from Austin, Texas. Emily, thanks for being part of Courageous Conversations.
Thanks, I appreciate it.
Tell our listeners what you teach and how long you've been teaching.
Yeah, so it's Emily Glankler, but everyone always misses the second L, so it's totally fine. I missed it on my own wedding invitation, so it's fine. But I have taught high school history in Austin, Texas for 11 years now. I taught all the way from 6th grade through 12th grade, my first few years at a very small, religiously conservative private school. And I've taught all the way up to at a very large traditional high school. I, like Monty, kind of specialize in now AP. So AP World History is my expertise, but I've taught AP US, on-level US. And I've uniquely been lucky that every year I've taught, whether it's at a small private school, large public school, I've gotten the chance to teach a class dedicated to talking about contemporary issues and current events, which I feel like has given me some rare experience of like this sandbox where I can figure out how to do it with a group of students who in theory signed up to talk about that every day. And then I also now run my own business that's called Anti-Social Studies, where I'm actually like actively trying to do this in the wider world. So I'm trying to use social media and the internet to help people contextualize what's going on in the world today by looking at history. So I kind of reverse it and say, like, you might be reading about something in the news. Let's go back in time and kind of understand how we got here. So, you can probably guess my stance on talking about current events in the classroom. I have a lot of positive experience and a lot of lessons learned, but I'm also really excited to talk to y'all and hear everyone's perspectives.
Well, thank you for that, Emily. And I'm looking forward to a discussion of what I think is a complex set of questions. And I suspect there may be some areas where we actually all agree. I don't hear anyone saying that we shouldn't talk about current events and controversies, but then we get into the details of what that looks like, and then there may be some interesting disagreements. So before I open up and ask you to start responding to some questions of mine, I want to review the conversation agreements that I sent out to you. And we use these and I hope that people listening adopt some of these conversation agreements, because I think it helps have more civil conversations. But we use them to ensure that we have respectful discussions, that any conflicts or differences that arise are healthy ones. So the first one is that we will limit our comments to the time allowed for each question. Number two, we will not interrupt or be disrespectful, and we will listen to understand others' perspectives. So with that, is everyone okay with those three agreements?
Of course.
Great. Okay. So I'm seeing thumbs up and nodding heads. All right. So the first question, and this relates to something that Amanda Ripley and others refer to as contact theory, that sometimes we go right into the controversies and we don't learn much about each other personally. And when we skip that step, it is a little easier to dehumanize and stereotype one another. So my first question is, and I'm hoping we can all each answer it in about a minute, which is, what do you love to do when you're not working? And so Monty, I'm going to come to you, and just in a minute or less, share your response to that question.
Well, when I'm not working, I like to read. I read a lot. I read, and so it's a bit of a busman's holiday sometimes, because I'm reading about politics. I'm reading about policy, government, history, but I also like being outdoors. And so I spend a lot of time outside, and I'm just very interested in kind of connecting with nature and kind of connecting with my world. So, and I do that with my wife and our dogs.
Terrific. Let's see. I'll go to back to you, Emily. I'll get your last name correct. Glankler.
Beautiful. Yeah, in my free time, I have a 5-year-old son, so he just started kindergarten. So that's taking up a lot of my free time. A lot of playing with Legos, a lot of learning what Minecraft is and how to play Minecraft. That's a lot of what I'm doing at the moment. It makes me feel very dumb. I also love to perform. I perform improv comedy in my free time. I put on shows with friends, and I love to travel. So really a lot of what I'm doing is like playing with my kid and then playing with my friends on stage and then getting to like go on historical tangents on social media. Like that's basically 80% of my life. It's pretty great.
Great. Thank you, Emily. John, how about you? What do you love to do when you're not working?
I love to work. And I'm always wondering sometimes whether I'm working or not, because it all kind of blends together. But I love to be outside also, and I love to read. I especially love history. History and philosophy are my two favorite subjects. And I like to garden and cut the grass and play pickleball. I've really gotten into that lately. I like to hunt and fish, and although I don't do much of it as I'd like these days.
Robert, how about you? When you're not working, what do you love to do?
I'm a volunteer fireman in my small town in upstate New York, so that takes some time. Hopefully, there'll be no alarms during the course of this conversation, and if I get up and leave, that's why. I'm also the president of my local library board, so that's becoming more and more of what I do. What I really love to do, if you'll see behind me, there's a large bookshelf. People think that that's a Zoom background. No, I built those bookshelves. So the writing and teaching and speaking, that's all fun and games. My real skill, it turns out, is hanging sheetrock and doing light construction. We bought this house 25 years ago. It had been abandoned, and I've become fairly handy since then. So that's kind of what I love to do. Is if I had all the time in the world, I'd be doing even more of it.
Thanks for sharing the personal parts of your life. We're going to jump right into the first of a couple of really, I think, important questions about our schools. And the first one is, what role should public schools play when it comes to teaching students about current events and controversial issues? And I'm sure each of you could spend a long time answering that question, but I'm going to ask you to do it in 3 minutes or less. Senator Schickel, why don't we start with you, John? I'll use your first name. I just want to say that in the SB1, there is a comment or a phrase that says it maintains a teacher's ability to teach current events in controversial subjects. So I take it that you're not opposed to that happening in schools at all.
Not at all. In fact, as you know, Ken, there's a controversy raging about school curriculum right now. And we were right in the middle of that, the last legislative session. And I really am happy with the legislation, Senate Bill 1. Max Wise, the education chair, who's now a candidate for lieutenant governor, he was by and large the author of the curriculum part of it. I was not. I focused more on school governance, which really goes hand in hand with curriculum. And we put the bill together, and I'm quite proud of it. It focuses on what we thought were some core documents that every student in Kentucky, by the time they graduate from high school, should be familiar with. And I think if you read over the bill, there's nothing in the bill that says that you cannot add, but it puts a base. And when I looked at the base, I think it's a pretty rigorous base. And when I read over it, I thought, boy, John, you need to do a little reading yourself here, because some of these documents, they were quite a few documents, and they were the core documents of the country. So I was very happy with it. In Kentucky, our public school system is a constitutional responsibility, and I think that's a good thing. And if you look at the founding of what the public school system is for, there's just, if you're in Frankfurt today, you would think the purpose of the public school system is that everybody get a good paying job. But really, the founders, that was not the purpose of the public school system. The purpose of the public school system was that citizens be knowledgeable enough to select their leaders in a representative republic. So that was the focus of this bill, and I'm very happy with it. And I think, as you know, Ken, in any bill, there's give and take. There's a few things in the bill I don't like. But overall, I'm very happy with Senate Bill 1.
I read something that I think you wrote, John, which is that your educational system should be teaching reading, writing, and arithmetic and factual history instead of politics. I'm just wondering how teachers can discuss current events and controversial topics and not be touching on politics.
Well, first of all, Ken, that sounds like something I'd probably say, so we'll go with it. But you have to take, I think, that phrase in context with a total conversations which I've had, especially this year, about the subject. The reason I said what I said was, and maybe I didn't say it very well, because obviously you're going to have to talk about politics. But so I probably didn't say that part of it very well. But the reason I said what I said is I think the emphasis should be on the 7 liberal arts. Because if we teach those 7 liberal arts that for 2,000 years have shown to be able to, I think Western civilization overall has been very successful. And I think the United States has been very successful and very blessed. So I believe in that basis of an education so young adults, children that grow into young adults can think critically about issues and make up their own mind on current events. And that is what I was trying to say, maybe not very well in what you said. And so I said this should stay out of politics. It's just like, I say I'm in public service, not politics. Well, obviously I'm in politics too, Ken. And obviously in school, you're going to be discussing politics. But I think the whole idea is, where is the emphasis? And the point I was trying to make is that our schools should be, I'm so excited all these history teachers on this conference, because, and Emily was saying, history, there's no new problems. And if we look at things through the context of history, we're much better off, I think, than just sitting and talking about current events. And what happens, I think, sometimes is people, we just have these sessions where people just kind of talk about current events, and they don't have and the foundation of critical thinking through grammar, logic, rhetoric, arithmetic, astrology, music, and geometry are not used as a foundation.
So, Emily, I'm going to come to you. And before I have you respond to the question, could you take a shot at summarizing what you think Senator Schickel, where he's coming down on this question of the role schools should play, just in a short version, and we'll ask him if you got it right.
Yeah, I'll do my best. What I'm hearing is that, understanding that if we're going to talk about U.S. history, U.S. government, and we're going to talk about recent U.S. history and U.S. government, that, it sounds like Senator Schickel, you understand that is going to include politics. But it sounded like your approach would be focusing on the curriculum, which is focusing on the history, focusing on the other skills, so that then, I don't know that last part, but focusing on those skills, I guess, so that then students have the ability to explore controversial topics and current politics on their own.
John, did she get that right?
I think she gets about 100%. I think she got it very right. She said it better than I could say it.
All right. So that nicely done, Emily. So I'm going to, Robert, come to you next and have you respond to the question. Again, I'd like all of you to be listening, because we'll have a chance later if people want to ask one another a question. Robert, what are your thoughts about the role of schools should play when it comes to controversial topics and current events?
A lot of what the senator said actually resonates with me quite a lot. Something I'm very fond of saying is that Horace Mann went to his grave without ever having once uttered the phrase college and career ready. That was not what public schools were built for. Public schools were built to prepare men and women, and yes, mostly men, for civic engagement. So that was the founding purpose of public education. So that makes current events indispensable. Obviously, as an elementary school teacher in a previous life, it's a meaningless discussion without literacy. So it starts there. But no apologies need to be made for schools teaching current events, or for current events becoming enmeshed in the curriculum. And I say this as something of a curriculum fetishist. Honestly, that's most of the work that I do. I think the real controversies come into play when we consider the role of a teacher. Before we hit record, Ken, you and I were having this discussion. I was describing my own journey through schools of education, and I was a mid-career switcher. I didn't become a teacher until I was almost 40. But it was news to me to find out long after I was a teacher and long after my ed school days had ended, that in the eyes of the law, teachers are not considered free agents. We are not considered activists. We are considered, quote, hired speech. There are court decisions about that. So that should have been impressed upon me at some point during my time as a teacher, as a full-time teacher, that look, you really don't have, even though it is de facto, it is the way that most teachers operate, you are operating within a system. And that system leans on a certain amount of not just accountability, but when I say you were hired speech, this was from a court decision that said that teachers just do not have, or there are strict limits on teachers' First Amendment rights in the classroom. You are hired by a school board, by a district, so we don't have the free reign that many teachers assume, and we can get into that at a later point. But the long story short is that look, we have drifted away from the idea of preparation for civic citizenship and civic engagement as a founding purpose of school, and even an ongoing purpose for school. It's one that needs to be brought back and be made front and center, but it cannot be just choose your own adventure, so to speak. It cannot be left to the discretion of individual teachers. We operate in a public context. We have to be mindful of that.
Monty, let's come to you next. Share your views about this question we've been focused on, which is the role of schools when it comes to controversial topics and current events.
Well, I guess my question would be, first off, what's a controversial topic? I mean, a controversial topic is pretty much any topic about which people disagree with enough passion in order to continue the disagreement to try to pursue their end. And, as a government teacher, that sounds pretty much like what Madison was trying to protect in Fed 10, with the idea that, that liberty and the freedom to speak, the freedom to exchange ideas is essential to democracy and essential to our republic. And so the solution is not to try to silence speech, and he uses this wonderful metaphor that liberty is to faction what air is to fire. And that if you were to remove the air, which is what happens when you take away the right to speak, that removing the air would put out the fire. But fire's a tool. It's more appropriate to contain the fire in an appropriate vessel. And so public school becomes that vessel for training students how to engage with issues in a safe place that is specifically designed for that purpose, using modes of inquiry, where the teacher is trained to guide students, first off, teaching them the skills necessary for effective inquiry, and then to guide them through it so that students can come to understandings on their own and truly determine and find out what it is they think. And public schools are essential because they are provided by the public or provided by the state, and access is available to everyone. So, the idea that teachers are somehow free actors, I get it. We are agents of the state. We are state employees. But my biggest concern is that these restrictions on teachers are actually restrictions on students, and they are a very dangerous restriction of students' First Amendment right to know. I mean, if we are true to the First Amendment's right to freedom of speech, freedom of the press, and freedom to peaceably assemble, then that is the freedom to convey information, which has kind of an implicit freedom to have access to that information. And if that information is being controlled so that students don't have the ability to know and to be able to explore for themselves ideas, so that to develop into the engaged citizens that I think we all want them to be. And again, as Robert said, it goes back to the founders. That's what Jefferson, Franklin, Washington, and Benjamin Rush were all about.
Thanks so much, Monty, for that. And I think I'm going to come to you next, Emily, and then John, I might have you try to give a shot at summarizing what you've heard Emily say.
I think I want to echo a lot of what Monty said. I mean, I really believe that, all of us are talking about the importance of public school as a place to teach students how to be knowledgeable citizens and how to be able to actively engage in their civic duties as citizens. And to me, in a 21st century world, the number one skill that citizens need is how to sift through the avalanche of information that they're coming across, right? I mean, we just don't live in a world anymore where you get Walter Cronkite coming on the news and that's how it is, right? It's like students can go find any information they want at any time, right? They can go find it online, and they need those skills to be taught to them by experts, teachers who know how to help them inquire about what's the point of view and where's fact and where's the opinion. Is this an editorial? Is this all of those skills are things that I think is the number one skill a student needs when they graduate and become a voting age in the country. And it's not about, I think one of the issues too is that right now I feel like people are talking about teachers as if teachers are all of a sudden becoming political in the classroom. And what I'm observing is that politics is now making teaching political when it wasn't before. I know topics that I've taught in U.S. history and world history for over a decade were never controversial. But all of a sudden, me teaching factually about something that happened in the past has taken on a political tone that it never had before. And so I think the issue is this kind of two-way street of, it's not necessarily, I think, teachers bringing in their own politics to the classroom. It's politics kind of walking into the classroom and starting to interpret issues that weren't ever controversial up until this recent kind of political era, and then putting that spin on them. And I agree with Monty that I think that classrooms at their best are this safe space to play with fire, right? I love that metaphor, and are this safe space to teach kids those skills. And then they walk out my door and are going to come to whatever conclusion they're going to come to. But hopefully I've helped them get the best information they can to then decide how they view an issue.
Thanks, Emily. And John, Emily had a lot to say there. I wonder if you can try to briefly summarize at least a couple of key points that you heard, and we'll check with Emily to see if you got it accurately.
I'm nervous. I'm going to try to do a good job. That students are exposed to a lot of information from a lot of different sources, as opposed to not too long ago when it was really just kind of a couple of different sources, which we kind of all took for granted, or some of us took for granted was true, and that they need to have, to use the term, experts to teach them how to sift through this and to know what is opinion and what is factual. And then she shifted a little bit to something that I think I see too, and that is that things are made political now, that because the tone, and this is my word, the tone is so high, the volume is so loud, that maybe things that were not political just not too long ago, I guess teachers have become politicized. Is maybe what I heard her say, and that is hard for teachers to deal with, and maybe they didn't sign on for that.
Emily, did John get that right? Is there any thing that he was mischaracterized or any really important point that he didn't say?
No, I think that was great. I think that teachers being politicized is true. I like that addition, and I think that my experience teaching history is that lessons I've done for 10 years that were never controversial to students or parents 10 years ago all of a sudden are, and nothing has changed about the US history I'm teaching. It's that the climate is entering the classroom that makes it difficult. So I appreciate that.
So I'm wondering where the conflict is, because it sounded like most of what you said was sort of consistent with one another, but that's just me. So I want to shift to the second major question here, which is when it comes to curriculum in the public schools, who should decide what it is? And in particular, because this question has been raised, is being raised across the country, what's the role that parents should play when it comes to what's included in the curriculum? And John, we haven't heard from you for a bit, so I'm going to come to you and allow you to give you 3 minutes to respond to that question.
Thank you, Ken. As state senator, this is something I've been dealing with in real life very recently, that question of who determines curriculum. And part of Senate Bill 1 was school governance. In Kentucky, we have a kind of a different type of model. We had something called site-based councils, and I won't go into that, but the parents, there's a real disconnect between, I think, what Emily calls experts and parents about school curriculum right now. And I've been in the Senate for 14 years, and I too have taught at the university level, and I'm also a substitute school bus driver. I like to get into schools and see what's going on firsthand. And I really see, I think it was COVID and remote learning that really opened up parents' eyes to what was going on in the schools, and they saw it firsthand. They weren't reading, hearing about it at a PTA meeting or reading about it on the school's webpage. They were seeing what Johnny and was viewing and what Johnny was learning, and they were viewing teachers doing their jobs. And I think, as Robert said, and I really never really thought of it before in the way he said it, but I totally agree with it. Teachers are agents of the state in the public school system. And so who determines curriculum by its very nature is very controversial. And I don't think there's any one answer, but I do think that and that was the governance part of Senate Bill 1, that it put parents through the superintendent, through the school board, to have the final say on curriculum. And I think that's appropriate.
Thanks for that. John, Robert, would you like to go next?
The senator is absolutely right. I mean, just constitutionally, states have unquestioned power to set curriculum. That is functionally the law of the land. Teachers get a very different set of impulses. I love telling the story of one of my earliest days in the classroom when there were lots of people eager to tell me how to teach. But when I asked the question, well, what should I be teaching? My staff developer said, well, Mr. Pandisio, you're the best person to know what every child needs. And I thought she was making fun of me. There was kind of a hazing ritual in a sense. I mean, I had no business then or now knowing what fifth graders in the South Bronx or any part of this country needed to learn to be literate and to be effective future citizens. But I'll throw a little data at you. There have been any number of studies, most notably the Rand Institute has shown that, like, I'm not making this number up, literally 98% of elementary and middle school teachers rely on materials that they either found or created or customized on their own. So the idea that if that curriculum is what gets taught, what was the line from Hamlet? It's a custom more honored in the breach than the observance. And let me be clear, this is not to suggest there's a conspiracy here. This is best practice. As I was told in my early days of teaching, well, the teacher's job is to engage the learner. So you use the curriculum, so to speak, if one exists at all. In most schools, it does not. You use that as a starting point, and then you differentiate, you customize, you figure out the thing that it is that's going to engage every student. So if we emerge from this conversation with no other understanding, please know this: the idea that there is, that somebody is coming down, with all respect for the senator, from a state house with the curriculum engraved on a stone tablet, and therefore that's what's happening in schools. I promise you that is not what's happening in schools. This is why teachers' viewpoints about curriculum and teachers' viewpoints about these issues are essential, because that's what's happening in classrooms, not what lawmakers decide, what teachers decide.
Great. Monty, why don't you go next? What's the role, who should be determining the curriculum?
First off, curriculum as a general matter is coming from the state, and it goes from the state. So the state creates the standards and the framework, and then it goes to the school district, and then it goes to the schools. So I worry about this, this statement, and I've read the Wren report, and it boils. Part of it is a question of how do we define curriculum, because there are a lot of different definitions of curriculum, and in fact, Rand has two different definitions of curriculum. One is a very, very, very tight definition that gets all the way down to the last instructional material that might come into the flow of a course, whereas on their website, they talk about it as the classes, the courses that constitute a course of study, and that is set by a high school or a primary element or primary or secondary school, college or beyond. And so, getting back to it, curriculum. And then College Board and International Baccalaureate set curriculum themselves. And so we as teachers use those to construct and curate the courses that we are responsible for teaching. And we are given certain freedom. Now, it's limited freedom, but it's our professional, that's professionally what we do. We are not simply technicians or robots simply reading from a script. That undermines what is one of the core elements of teaching, which is relationship. How can you know what is going to engage a particular set of students until you understand your students and have evaluated them preliminarily about where they are and what is going to appeal to them? Because one set of materials or materials presented a particular way is not going to appeal to every student. So that relationship becomes essential. And then relevance is the next piece. But it's all about, at the end of the day, it's rigor. But getting back to the big question, curriculum, presumably there's a lot of stakeholders here. And in a public school, the stakeholders, the big stakeholders, the public, and parents are a stakeholder, teachers are stakeholders, but we have a process that is like the rulemaking process, where the public has, an opportunity to comment on curriculum that is created, whether it's at the state level or down at the school board level. And I think it's important that we have that, that we have that understanding, and the teachers then are curating to within what is a pretty clear constraint to appeal and help the students be their best selves and do their best in their class.
Thanks, Monty. Emily, we'll hear from you next on who should be deciding what the curriculum is.
Yeah, so for one, I agree with what Robert and Monty said. I think is really important for anyone listening who's never been a classroom teacher, that my first year teaching, I was like, where's my curriculum? And it was like, yeah, here you go. Here are the standards that are incredibly vague for the most part. And then it's like, good luck. And I was 21 trying to figure out, oh my gosh, what do I teach seniors about U.S. history? And that's terrifying. My issue is that I don't think that should be a political process to determine that curriculum. If I'm thinking about, I'm a historian, I'm teaching history, I want to know what historians say should be taught about U.S. history. And I think that, the people involved in the state legislature can be involved in that, parents and teachers, but I think primarily it should be the experts in that field who are going to be historians, for example, who are going to be people who have dedicated their life to learning about that. Because if I'm being totally honest, in Texas, I'm being told what to teach mostly by a group of people who've never stepped foot in a classroom since they were students and don't have degrees in what they're telling me what to teach. And that feels very frustrating. And that's why I do take issue with that, like, agents of the state. Like, I understand that legally, I know that's what you're referencing, but I take issue with this implication that it's like we're just sort of fed, because to me, that's the exact problem we're talking about, right? I mean, I'm teaching in a very conservative state, Texas. And so we're talking about wanting to have teachers who aren't biased and who aren't sharing their political views. Well, literally in the state standards, the economics course in Texas says economics focusing on the free market economy and its benefits. That's literally what the course is titled according to the state standards. And I'm not anti-free market, but to me, that seems like a biased view that you're literally telling all teachers you're going to focus on the positive elements of this aspect of the course. And so I think we're all saying the same thing, but I think that what it comes down to is that we're differing on what we think is controversial and like what maybe political slant we think is being overtaught in schools, right? And that's where I think the kind of unspoken disagreement is coming from, that we're all saying that we agree with not, that current events should be talked about in class. But I think that if it came down to the nuts and bolts of like, what exactly are we talking about here, that's where we would disagree.
John, I have a question for you, because I think you more than others were promoting the idea that parents should play a really major role. And one of the things you did with SB1 was to give more power, I think, to parents through a superintendent. And but and maybe I don't have this quite right, but I'm just wondering, what if parents in a particular school district, if they were given the kind of power that I think you're defending, were to decide that they didn't want current events or controversial issues discussed at all? Or in another district, parents wanted every student in the school to be taught about critical race theory, or at least some of the concepts connected to it. Uh, what is the role of the state vis-a-vis parents in sort of balancing out? Isn't there some role in the state saying there should be a set of standards, that there are certain things we want all kids in our state to know, and we don't want any particular district deciding, for instance, that we don't want any books written by LGBTQ authors, which is happening now in some school districts. So I'd love your response in terms of balancing the state's obligations to set standards and your desire, and I share this, that parents need a voice as well. How would you want to balance those two things?
Well, you ask a very complicated question, and it's a question that I myself am conflicted about. And what we tried to do in Senate Bill 1 was set balance. Myself, I'm not a parent. I'm not blessed with children. And I'm a lifelong bachelor, don't have any children. And but I have a responsibility to pay for the schools. I have an interest in children being educated, and I'm very concerned about it. So I probably should correct myself a little bit, Ken, if I gave the impression that it's just parents that should decide this, because I think it's our society as a whole that should decide it. Because collectively, this is probably the single biggest factor in whether we rise or sink as a society. But the people who live in my community, who live in my school taxing district, who pay the bills, I think should, at the end of the day, have the final say. We do in Kentucky have state standards, but Senate Bill 1 does give the school board, the superintendent is a so-called, or I should say, is an expert. I'm afraid of that word expert in education because I've been burnt too many times, but he or she is an expert. And so it will be filtered through that expert and through the great teachers that we have in our schools. But at the end of the day, the public at large who pays for the education, who has a vested interest in the education, I can't think of any group more suitable to decide this than those folks.
And John, if they decide to throw out all the state standards and come up with their own curriculum, are you okay with that?
Well, I don't know that I would be okay with it, Ken. You know, I'm a state legislator, and in our Constitution, it's the state that has a responsibility to provide that public education. So at the end of the day, that would probably be, even according to our Constitution, a state question. But the same thing could happen on a state level. Legislators could vote to do that. I think it all goes back to what we were talking about in the beginning of the program. When you live in a representative republic, the reason education is so important is people have to be enlightened. And something that I wanted to, that hasn't been said, but not all opinion, not all knowledge is the same. We have knowledge that's been tested down through 2,000 years. We have great writers. Okay, we have people over 2,000 years. And that's what I was trying to talk about in the beginning of the program about the liberal arts education, because if the people, and why I resist so much turning our schools into vocational schools, because not the jobs aren't important, not the vocational training. That's what my training was in. I have a master's degree in public administration. I now see the error of my ways. But at the end of the day, if we don't have an enlightened public, if we don't have an enlightened citizenry, we're sunk. And that in a representative republic, the United States of America now someone please correct me if I'm wrong, but I think I'm historically correct, is the longest surviving representative republic in the world. So this is critical, but I don't think there's an easier answer to it. I think the answer is the liberal arts education.
Thank you for that, John. Robert, a quick question for someone else.
Well, can I just comment on a few things? Because so many things have been said in the last 5 minutes that I'm just dying to respond to. I mean, one, just as a point of order, let's be super clear on this. Standards are not content. Standards tend to describe the skills that children should be able to learn and demonstrate, but they are absolutely, at least on the ELA side and generally history as well, they're content agnostic. Two, it just won't do, folks, to valorize democracy, but then say, but not at the local level. In other words, we're going to be all about preparing children for democratic processes, but we're going to say, but you don't get a say about what happens democratically in your own local school district. I mean, that's just not okay. You had mentioned, Ken, something about like school districts moving to take LGBTQ authors. With respect, sir, I just don't think that's a thing. I don't know of a single district that is doing that. And frankly, it would be impossible. No Walt Whitman, no Hans Christian Andersen, no Lord Byron. You couldn't take LGBTQ authors out of the curriculum or out of the canon, so to speak, if you wanted to. But look, the larger point here, and I think this is the kind of thing we need to surface and just face up to. I laugh when people say, well, look, schools shouldn't be a front for the culture war. What do you think schools do? What do you think schools have always done? By definition, a school is where we send our children to learn the best of what has been thought and said and written. You can't, it's where you go to learn the things that we value, the things we condemn. By definition, a school it's the original culture war front. It is literally the function of a school to pass on to its children the things we praise and the things we condemn. That's culture. You can't get around this.
Emily, I want to come to you next, and then Monty. But Emily, just a point. Aren't there not school districts in Texas where parents are demanding that books written by LGBT?
It's happening in many places. Florida signed a law statewide that's empowering parents to sue school districts for teaching about LGBTQ issues they don't like. And they've banned. I think the thing that I would like to share is that I think that the system before this current political climate was that parents were already empowered. This is the issue I have, is there's this narrative that parents need to have some say in what their kids are being taught. They always did. For one, so do political, for when they can vote for the people who are determining, like you say, the state standards. For two, I knew as a teacher, a parent email, a parent complaint to my boss always went a very long way. The idea that parents have somehow been silenced until now, and now we're going to give them a voice is, I think, kind of crazy. I think like the idea that people weren't listening to what parents wanted, the idea that a parent couldn't then talk to their child for the rest of their life about the political issues and helping them understand what their teacher said or didn't say that they thought was right or wrong. It was always balanced where parents had a say. What's happening now is that parents it's getting skewed. I know that I'm talking to teachers who are scared to even say certain things in their curriculum that are factually correct. There was a balance where parents had a say and parents could talk about with their students and even talk to their teachers. I know I've had many meetings with parents about what their student can learn. The issue I have is now parents are being able to determine what all students can and can't learn. And that's where I have an issue.
Emily, thanks for that. Monty, your thoughts on this?
Yeah, I mean, I echo what Emily's saying. And I also value what Robert was saying. I mean, that's the point. If, one of the concerns, and we can just go to PEN America is doing a heck of a job trying to catalog what they're characterizing as educational gag orders. And they're looking at the book censorship, which is, where it's happening, it's pretty intense and it's quite terrifying. And while today it may be current literature, what's to keep it from, spreading to, down the canon, as you said, Robert, to once people find out that somebody said something or was of a particular perspective that is not welcome. And my concern is, I get what you're saying as well about democracy. There is a concern. We've got to distinguish between democracy and, as, the ancients exercised it, which is majority rule, with how we do it, which needs to be taught and emphasized, which is majority rule with the protection of minority rights. Because otherwise you get the paradox of democracy, which is that a majority of 51% can vote to eliminate democracy, just like they could vote to eliminate the study of a particular type of material or particular ideas. And it's the rhetoric and the behavior and what Emily characterized as the feeling of threats is chilling teachers and leading them to choose not to teach certain material, to not introduce certain ideas. I teach a Cold War lesson where I have students read an excerpt from Robert Kagan's, on the origins of war, and I put him in conversation on the Cold War with Eric Hobsbawm, one of the leading, Marxist historians of the 20th century, so that they can see those two competing perspectives. Am I teaching them to be communists? No, I'm teaching them to see the different perspectives. It's like General Milley saying, I've studied Mao and Marx and all, but it didn't make me a communist. It doesn't, and so we need to protect the minority right to learn and to know, so that, what is the flavor of the day in terms of majority view doesn't tyrannically eliminate the, what could be the great idea of tomorrow, or the critical thinking that becomes the creative idea that takes us to tomorrow.
Thank you for that, Monty. I think, Robert, I take exception to one thing you said at the end about, schools are where the culture wars have always been happening. And I think you're referring to the healthy kind of conflict where people are discussing complicated ideas and they disagree with each other, and I'm all for that. I think we all are. What I worry about and what I think is posing a real threat to public education is the type of culture wars that have escalated to the point where people are demonizing each other and literally yelling at each other in school board meetings and not having the kind of thoughtful, respectful dialogue that we had here today. And that's what worries me. And that's why I launched this podcast, Courageous Conversations About Our Schools, because I think the culture wars are dangerous and damaging and are not advancing the interests of our communities, of education, and our democracy. So that's why I'm doing this podcast. And I just want to thank again all of you for being part of this. And to our listeners, I just want to let all of you know that you can find all of our episodes of Courageous Conversations About Our Schools at www.penn.org. www.schoolconversations.org and on your favorite podcasting platform. So with that, I'm going to say so long, everybody.